Survival Skills. The first in a series of episodes chronicling God's providence at a crucial time in the life of a newly minted assistant professor. A small city in the upper Midwest, spitting distance from the Canadian border. I didn't know then that the Lord wanted me there, but looking back now it seems glaringly obvious. On a cold, wet evening in early spring 2002, a large, unsmiling, gray-bearded man introduced himself in the baggage claim lobby. Harold. We shook hands. He looked around grimly. He hated airports. Those weren't the only things. He followed me to the carousel. President Bush, the Transportation Safety Administration, first-class seating on airplanes, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, right-wing conspiracies trying to take over America. My heart sank. It was my 5th interview in a 2-year-long search for a college teaching position. The first 4 hadn't gone well. This one was starting off even worse. Harold was chair of the search committee. After the interview, he'd write a letter recommending whether to hire me. What was I supposed to say to him now? I voted for Bush. I liked Rumsfeld. As far as I knew, the TSA was doing its job. What do you say to a man who seethes with resentments you don't share and holds your future in the palm of his hand? En route to a restaurant, we took a short detour through a public park. Harold was crestfallen. The park was poorly maintained. Voters refused to raise property taxes, especially the rich who could afford them. I hoped fervently he wasn't going to ask me how I voted. It had been a long day. 2 changes of planes, airport security, and now Harold. But standing in line at the restaurant, waiting for the hostess to find us a table, I had a sudden flash of insight, as vivid as if a voice spoke to me. If I wanted this job, I was going to have to cheer Harold up over dinner. I'd had no such flash of insight during my first interview, nor in any that followed. That's how I know, looking back, that the Lord wanted me out there in the middle of nowhere. The restaurant had a view of the water. Harold loved it. I pretended to love it as well. All through dinner I did my best to cheer him up. I enthused over the watery chili he recommended. I agreed that if schools were run better, the scourge of racism would be lifted and the lives of all poor children would be transformed. Playing along like this was painful, even though I never directly said anything I didn't believe. I'm as much in favor of improving life chances for poor children as anyone else, but I'm lukewarm on schemes to improve schools. They sound good, but they cost a lot, and I've never seen one that made much of an actual difference in schools. For the rest of my time here, I'd have to be extremely careful what I said on this subject to Harold or anyone else I met. The next day I was interviewed by the search committee, Harold and the other faculty in the program. I was on tenterhooks. During the last interview, I'd been taken to task over a paper I wrote on homeschooling. It's a sensitive topic for educators, especially those who trained licensed teachers, the job I was applying for. They know schools aren't perfect, but they're all sure their favorite theories will fix them if only enough government funds are provided. Anyone who pulls children out is a traitor. To my relief, Harold and the others didn't seem all that interested in my scholarship. Their questions were vague, and the answers I gave were so superficial, I doubt the search committee even knew what point I was making. They were much more interested in what I had to say about teaching. Here was a minefield I couldn't avoid. They had a course focused on multiculturalism. How would I go about teaching it? Time to tread carefully. Multiculturalism is an umbrella term covering everything from critical race theory and white privilege to the obvious fact that people in the United States come from different cultural backgrounds. Harold had already told me how important it is for future teachers to learn about undeserved privilege. I couldn't let on what I thought of this idea, so I kept my comments vague and very general. Of course it's important to get to know our students and show respect for their backgrounds. Yes, we should teach them to do likewise when they become teachers themselves. I could see Harold wanted to press further on this, but Paul, the program coordinator, steered the conversation in a different direction. Was I prepared to bring consistency to a multi-section course with an annual enrollment of hundreds of students? The introductory course was taught by 4 or 5 different instructors. Paul worried that the students might not all be learning the same material. Just supposing I was in a position to do something about it, how would I approach a problem like this? Definitely not a scenario I'd prepared for, but I had enough experience teaching college part-time to throw out a few suggestions. A common syllabus, a common textbook, standard assignments. Paul liked that, but how would I make sure the other instructors followed my lead? We seemed to be pretty far afield of the job I was interviewing for. Where was this sudden interest in course oversight coming from? How secure was Paul in his role as program coordinator? Was he planning to shift some of his responsibility onto me even before I was hired? It was another small flash of insight, not as dramatic as last night's about Harold, but still highly unusual. I wasn't used to reading the minds of people deciding my future. It was hard to believe, but I'd been a step ahead of my questioners the whole way. I didn't ask myself how I could have figured all this out so quickly. I'd have been shocked if you suggested someone infinitely wiser and more powerful than me might be responsible for these newfound survival skills. Insight into the character of my interviewers didn't stop there. Afterward, I went to lunch with another committee member. We were waited on by an attractive young woman who turned out to be his former student. He called her Honey and seemed to be unable to take his eyes off her low-cut blouse. "Sweet girl," he confided as we waited for our meals to arrive. "I really had enjoyed having her in my classes." I filed that tidbit away. Danger zone. Useful information if I did get the job. Another possible future colleague, who I was supposed to have dinner with, was headed out to his vacation home. Would I mind eating earlier? Of course not. He was the host, wasn't he? He picked me up at 4 p.m. We were the only ones in the restaurant. After a token attempt at conversation, he rushed through his meal. Anxious not to be more of a nuisance to him than I clearly already was, I rushed through mine. I seemed to be learning more about the faculty in this program than they were about me. The survival skills lovingly heaped on me brought about the result I had hoped for. Soon after I got back home from the trip, the dean called with a job offer. Later that summer, my wife and I packed up our kids and the dog and our household goods and set out on the 1,000-mile journey to our new home. God was good to us. Many wonderful things happened in that faraway town, where the summer days were thick with mosquitoes and the highway entrance ramps had gates to block traffic during blizzards. In the next few posts, I'll share some of those blessings, but I need to mention the biggest one here. Soon after I arrived on that tiny remote campus, I came to know who it was who had sent me those flashes of insight and made sure I gave all the right answers during that gut-wrenching interview.